Picture this. Vienna, 1793. The air inside the imperial palace is heavy with incense and anticipation. From behind closed doors the cries of labor subside, and attendants lift a newborn heir into the world. For a moment the court exhales in relief. An emperor is born, but the triumph falters almost instantly. The infant's body trembles with every breath. His skull, uneven beneath the embroidered cap, bulges where bone should have joined. Courtiers exchange uneasy glances as the seconds pass. The child does not cry. When his eyes open they drift without focus. The empress, pale and motionless, stares in horror at what she has brought into the world. What is meant to secure the dynasty's future reveals itself, from the first breath, as the beginning of its decline. In him, the centuries of ambition and alliance had reached their biological limit. The empire that ruled half of Europe had produced an heir, unable to master his own heartbeat. Physicians called it nervous weakness. Priests called it divine trial. History would later name it what it was: the body of an empire consuming itself. Before his epileptic fits shook thrones, before his speech dissolved into broken prayers, before ministers learned to hide their emperor from his own people, Ferdinand of Austria was celebrated as the future of a dynasty already dying inside its own perfection. This is the documented story of what happens when human arrogance makes incest a political strategy. What modern geneticists would later uncover in this family's DNA should have been impossible. Mutations stacked generation upon generation until nature itself broke. Before we dive in, quick reminder to subscribe to Rotten Ages if you enjoy these videos. Let us know where in the world you are watching from. We really appreciate it. Now, let me take you back to April 19th, 1793. Archduchess Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily had gone into labor. The court physicians stood ready with silver instruments and whispered prayers. When the infant finally arrived, something felt wrong before he even cried. His skull was oddly shaped, the skin wax pale, his limbs trembling as though touched by invisible current. The empress looked down and, according to attendants, fell silent in dread. Ferdinand's mother had watched the curse of consanguinity travel down generations. She was both niece and cousin to her own husband, Emperor Francis II. The child in her arms was not only her son, he was the echo of centuries of genetic repetition. The Habsburg family tree had long since stopped branching. It looped back upon itself like a snake devouring its own tail. For 200 years, Happy Austria Marry had been more than a motto. Cousins married cousins, uncles wedded nieces, bloodlines folded inwards again and again. They called it dynastic prudence. Science calls it genetic collapse. Modern analysis of the Habsburg genome shows that by the late 18th century, their inbreeding coefficient hovered near the same lethal threshold as the Spanish branch centuries earlier, around a 0.2, far beyond what nature can tolerate. From the beginning, Ferdinand's body bore the price. The royal physicians noted prolonged seizures in infancy. His skull sutures closed too early, causing the head to bulge strangely at the temples. His lips and tongue didn't coordinate, so milk dribbled constantly from the corners of his mouth. Nurses said he would stare at ceiling frescoes for hours without blinking, then suddenly convulse so violently that the cradle shook. They called them holy attacks. In an age before neurology, epilepsy was the language of possession. Priests sprinkled holy water, doctors prescribed mercury and leeches. Nothing worked. The imperial nursery filled with the stench of burnt feathers and sulphur folk remedies meant to frighten the devil from the child. But the devil, if there was one, lived in his chromosomes. By age 4, Ferdinand still couldn't walk steadily. His legs bowed under his small frame, his feet turning inward. His tutors carried him from chamber to chamber, as servants once carried Charles II of Spain. The resemblance was uncanny. Both boys were living warnings that bloodlines too pure become poison. He tried to speak, but words came out fractured, as though his tongue were too heavy for his mouth. Court records mention a peculiar lisp and constant drooling. The imperial painters would later soften his portraits, showing a composed prince with intelligent eyes. In reality, he could barely form a sentence without help. His nursemaids learned to interpret his murmurs as one might translate an infant's cries. The court physicians described a nervous fragility. He tired easily, slept erratically, and suffered fevers without cause. When he smiled, it was a twitch more than expression, half involuntary, half pitiful. The boy who would someday rule an empire lived within a body that rejected its own commands. And yet, around him, the empire prospered. Francis II fought revolutions, reshaped Europe, crowned himself Emperor of Austria after Napoleon's rise. But inside the palace, the heir to that empire trembled at the sound of thunder. His education was a facade. Latin tutors, piano lessons, fencing masters, all orchestrated performances to convince visiting dignitaries that the Archduke was merely delicate, not defective. Behind closed doors, the truth was devastating. Ferdinand's handwriting was illegible, his arithmetic non-existent. He forgot his own tutors' names, lost track of days, and occasionally burst into tears without reason. When frustrated, he banged his head against marble walls, until attendants restrained him. Doctors called these nervous excitations. Today, we would call them seizures accompanied by postictal confusion. By adolescence, the physical deformities intensified. His head remained disproportionately large, his lower jaw protruding slightly, a pale echo of the ancestral Habsburg jaw. His upper teeth never quite met the lower. Eating required effort. He often swallowed food half-chewed. Court chefs softened meats in broth and soaked bread in wine. During banquets, an attendant discreetly wiped saliva from his chin. The empire dined on porcelain, its prince on mush. At 15, the doctors recorded a growth arrest. His height froze at barely 1.55 meters. His shoulders narrow, his limbs thin, his skin almost translucent. Puberty brought no change. The voice never deepened. The body remained childlike. Privately, the physicians suspected endocrine failure, a collapsed pituitary system similar to what later geneticists would identify in other inbred royals. But the report was sealed. Scandal was a greater threat than disease. The imperial family, desperate to prove continuity, began planning a marriage. They needed heirs, symbols of strength and public reassurance that the line still bred true. Yet even the emperor hesitated. How do you marry a boy who can barely stand, whose mind drifts in and out of coherence? Still, tradition demanded it. Power demanded it. At 19, Ferdinand experienced his first grand mal seizure in public. During Mass at the Hofburg Chapel, he stiffened, eyes rolling back, limbs thrashing as horrified nobles looked on. When he regained consciousness, his first words were an apology to God for interrupting the sermon. The spectacle cemented his reputation as fragile, almost saint-like, the sickly archduke who suffered for the sins of his house. But behind the pious legend was sheer neurological chaos. By 20 it was clear that Ferdinand's intellect would never mature. He could memorize prayers but not state documents. He could mimic etiquette, but not understand policy. Ministers began quietly managing the empire in anticipation of his eventual figurehead reign. The question wasn't if he could rule, it was how long the illusion could be sustained. And so the palace, gleaming with chandeliers and gilt, became a gilded asylum. Ferdinand lived surrounded by attendants, doctors and priests, who whispered constant reassurance. Outside, the world changed, revolutions brewing, ideologies clashing. But inside, time congealed around a prince trapped in childhood. The empire's greatest secret was not hidden in vaults or archives, but seated at its own dinner table, the future Emperor of Austria, a living monument to genetic decay. At 22, Ferdinand was proclaimed heir apparent to the Austrian Empire. Courtiers cheered, cannons thundered, and the bells of Vienna rang, as if celebrating a victory. But behind the sound of triumph, doctors exchanged uneasy glances. The heir's hands trembled constantly, his eyes blinked out of rhythm. During ceremonies, he would freeze mid-gesture, caught between thought and seizure, and his aides would gently guide him back into motion like a marionette whose strings had gone slack. The Habsburgs called it devotion, the physicians called it epilepsy. Dozens of episodes each month, sometimes mild, sometimes catastrophic. They left him pale, disoriented, his tongue bitten, his breath rasping. In moments of lucidity, Ferdinand would weep and ask whether God was punishing him for sins he didn't understand. It was easier to believe in divine wrath than to face the truth of biology. When his father died in 1835, Ferdinand ascended the throne as Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, titles that meant nothing to the body that bore them. The empire hid its weakness behind protocol. Every royal decree required the signature of Metternich, the cunning statesman who became the empire's true mind. Ferdinand's reign was a puppet show performed by a man who often couldn't hold the pen he was supposed to sign with. The coronation itself bordered on tragedy. During the anointing, Ferdinand suffered a minor seizure and collapsed against the altar. The archbishop pretended it was a gesture of humility, and continued the rite. As attendants steadied the convulsing monarch, paintings later depicted him kneeling in pious submission. The truth was less holy. The emperor's nervous system had simply shut down. Still, the empire insisted on appearances. The new emperor was married off at once, to Princess Maria Anna of Savoy, sister of the King of Sardinia, chosen for her docile temperament and robust health. The wedding in Vienna glittered with gold and chandeliers, but those who saw the couple up close spoke of unease. Maria Anna, 27, beautiful and composed, stood beside a trembling man whose lips quivered even at rest, his head tilted forward as if too heavy for his neck. His voice emerged thin and halting. When the priest commanded the groom to speak the vows, Ferdinand repeated them twice, stumbling on every word. The audience laughed softly, believing it nerve. Only his doctors knew it was neurological misfiring. The wedding night was whispered about for years. Servants reported groans, then silence, then sobbing. Physicians were discreetly consulted the next morning. The verdict, though never recorded officially, was that the marriage had not been consummated. Ferdinand, like so many of his Spanish ancestors, was physically incapable. Whether through impotence, deformity or sheer mental confusion, the result was the same. No heir would ever be born of this union. The palace responded with the same ritual denial that had sustained the dynasty for centuries. Holy relics were brought to the emperor's chamber. He slept with a rosary clenched in one hand, his wife weeping quietly beside him. Exorcists whispered prayers over his bed during seizures, sprinkling holy water that did nothing to still the trembling. A relic of Saint Leopold was even placed under his pillow in hopes that divine energy might restore virility. Nothing changed. Ferdinand remained a child trapped in a man's crown. He collected toy soldiers, fed them crumbs from his plate, and spent afternoons watching pigeons from palace windows. He was fascinated by clocks, sometimes disassembling them during sleepless nights, and crying when he couldn't fit the gears back together. Ministers learned to endure the charade, reading state reports to an emperor who nodded solemnly, but absorbed none of it. His speech deteriorated. Words slurred, saliva gathered at the corners of his mouth, and his attendants kept silk cloths at the ready. When angry, he shouted single phrases repeatedly. Do it, without context. Foreign diplomats wrote home describing audiences that felt like seances, a man alive in body but absent in mind. Physically, his decline continued. The epileptic fits increased in severity, often preceded by a strange metallic taste that made him clutch his mouth in terror. After each episode, he would sleep for hours, his breathing shallow and irregular. His left arm began to twitch even when awake, an early sign of permanent neurological damage. Physicians noted a slight droop in the right eyelid, and asymmetry in his face, possible remnants of minor strokes. The imperial portrait painters, once masters of idealization, now resorted to painting from imagination rather than life. By his early 30s, Ferdinand's body resembled that of an old man. His hair thinned to wisps, his skin sagged, and his movements became stiff and uncertain. Each step required focus. He developed digestive troubles, chronic bloating, vomiting, and pain. Symptoms likely caused by anticonvulsant tonics, laced with heavy metals. Court doctors experimented with mixtures of opium, arsenic, and tinctures of foxglove. None helped. At dinners, Maria Anna often cut his food into tiny pieces, feeding him discreetly while servants pretended not to notice. She adored him in her way, part pity, part duty. Their marriage, devoid of passion, became a quiet alliance of resignation. In her private letters, she described her husband as gentle as a child, suffering as a saint, and lost to the world. Outside the palace, Europe moved toward revolution. Inside, Ferdinand's mind receded into ritual. He prayed for hours, confessed sins he couldn't name, and wrote the same lines of scripture again and again in a shaky hand. Ministers handled affairs of state while maintaining the illusion that every decision came from the emperor's will. In truth, the empire was ruled by a council of caretakers. Visitors left the Hofburg whispering about the strange emperor. Some thought him holy, others thought him bewitched. His courtiers called him Ferdinand the Good, not for wisdom or mercy but because he never had the wit to be cruel. He smiled when spoken to, cried when scolded, and thanked every servant who wiped his chin. But behind the polite fiction, the Habsburg bloodline was dying in slow motion. Centuries of consanguinity had produced a monarch, unable to sire children, unable to rule, barely able to exist. By 1840, Ferdinand's doctors began documenting symptoms they dared not publish. Night terrors, loss of bladder control, periods of blank staring that lasted hours. They called them absences, now known as petit mal seizures. During these spells, the emperor's eyes remained open, his body rigid, but his consciousness vanished entirely. When he returned, he would ask what day it was and whether the bells had rung for mass. And still, no air. The court whispered that the Habsburg seed had turned to dust. Priests blamed demonic interference. Physicians blamed weak nerves. But history knows the culprit, the very blood they were so desperate to preserve. By his late 30s, Ferdinand's body had become a fragile cage for a flickering consciousness. The seizures came without warning. One moment he would be sitting quietly in his study, staring at a clock or fingering a rosary bead, and the next his entire body would stiffen, his lips foaming, his limbs convulsing so violently that attendants had to restrain him with padded straps. Afterwards he would lie motionless, drenched in sweat, whispering the same question over and over. Am I alive? Meanwhile his mind began to fracture in subtler ways. He forgot faces, mistook courtiers for dead relatives, and sometimes addressed his wife as mother. He would wander the corridors of the Hofburg in his nightshirt, muttering prayers to saints who had never existed. Servants often found him kneeling before blank walls, crossing himself and weeping. During these episodes he seemed aware of his decline. I am breaking, he told his confessor once. My body and my soul quarrel every hour. The empire continued to function, but only just. Metternich's iron control held the machinery together while Ferdinand drifted further into helplessness. Ministers disguised the emperor's absences by releasing decrees with his forged signature, sometimes months after he had last been lucid enough to read. Ferdinand's appearance grew disturbing. His skin, once pale, turned sallow and waxen. His lips hung open, his tongue thick and motionless between teeth that never met. His neck muscles weakened, his head tilted permanently to one side. The right eyelid drooped, saliva stained his collar. Food was still a daily ordeal. He could not chew without choking. His stomach rebelled after every meal. Court cooks blended his dishes into thin gruels flavored with wine to help him swallow. He vomited often and suffered chronic diarrhea, so severe that attendants lined his chair with perfumed linen. The combination of digestive failure and seizure medication, loaded with lead and mercury, accelerated his wasting. By 1844 his gait had deteriorated entirely. His legs, bowed and trembling, could no longer support him for more than a few minutes. He shuffled with a cane, sometimes dragging one foot behind him. His hands curled inward, his fingers twitched constantly, clattering the rosary beads that never left them. By 1846, Ferdinand was barely functional. He suffered prolonged seizures that left him temporarily paralyzed on one side. The imperial physicians attempted experimental remedies, bloodletting, electric shocks, even the inhalation of ether. None provided relief. He began to show symptoms of hydrocephalus. His head enlarged slightly, pressure behind the eyes caused headaches, so intense that he would scream for hours until sedated with opium. His mental clarity ebbed away completely after each attack. Visitors described scenes of almost gothic horror. The emperor propped in a velvet chair, mouth open, eyes unfocused, murmuring fragments of Latin prayers, while drool streamed down his chin. His attendants moved silently around him, wiping, feeding, adjusting pillows. Sometimes he would suddenly start singing church hymns at the top of his voice, then collapse into tears, and still the empire pretended. Metternich and the imperial council drafted speeches for Ferdinand to read at public appearances. He could barely get through 3 sentences before faltering. The crowds, unaware of the full extent of his illness, mistook his stammering for humility. Foreign envoys were carefully seated at a distance to obscure the trembling. The illusion of power depended on shadows, silk, and candlelight. Behind closed doors, the situation became untenable. Revolution was sweeping Europe. The year 1848 brought the streets of Vienna alive with protest and gunfire. As mobs stormed the capital, Ferdinand sat in his private chapel, clutching a crucifix, unaware of the scale of chaos outside. On December 2, 1848, in a solemn but pitiful ceremony, Ferdinand I abdicated the throne in favor of his young nephew, Franz Joseph. After abdication, Ferdinand was moved to the Fragitani Palace in Prague, a comfortable exile wrapped in velvet silence. Officially he was still His Imperial Majesty. Unofficially he was an invalid, His life became a long twilight of confusion, prayer, and physical collapse. He rose at dawn, attended mass, and spent hours arranging toy soldiers on his desk, commanding imaginary battles long lost to history. The fits persisted. Some lasted only seconds, others minutes. Each left him weaker. Doctors noted muscle atrophy, tremors, and gradual loss of speech. He communicated increasingly with gestures, his once labored words now reduced to whispers. His eyes retained a soft, almost childlike sadness. A man aware that something vital had left him long ago. By the 1860s, Ferdinand was a relic of another age. The seizures came daily. His speech was nearly gone, reduced to murmurs of prayer and fragments of childhood songs. Attendants guided him everywhere. His body had become stiff, his joints locked by decades of convulsions and poor circulation. When he smiled, it looked like a grimace. His physicians described progressive wasting of the faculties. The old terms, melancholy, nervous debility, no longer sufficed. What they were witnessing was the biological conclusion of centuries of inbreeding. Ferdinand's nervous system, battered from birth by epileptic storms, was collapsing. His immune defenses were failing. Minor infections turned into fevers that lasted weeks. His skin bruised easily. His hair fell out in clumps, and his eyes, once pale blue, turned glassy and vacant. He could barely swallow. Food had to be pureed into thin soups. Even then, he often choked, his throat spasming uncontrollably until blood flecked his lips. Nurses massaged his chest to keep fluid from filling his lungs. They changed the linens constantly, the once regal bed now reeking of sickness, sweat, and the sour scent of decay. The imperial physician noted in his journal, "Each seizure strips him further of life. It is as though the body is being dismantled one nerve at a time." By 1870, Ferdinand rarely left his room. His mind wandered in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he believed he was still emperor and demanded to hear petitions. In 1874, his final decline began. Chronic pneumonia set in, complicated by kidney failure and the side effects of decades of heavy metal treatments. His breath rattled like broken glass. The imperial physicians administered morphine to dull the pain, but the convulsions persisted even in sleep. In his last weeks, he could not speak at all. His tongue was swollen, his jaw locked, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He weighed barely 40 kilograms. On June 29, 1875, as dawn filtered through the curtains of his Prague bedroom, Ferdinand I of Austria died. The attendants crossed themselves, the priests began the final rites, and the doctors prepared for what the court insisted must remain secret: the autopsy. They cut open the emperor's body that afternoon. The report, written in stiff Latin, still exists in fragments in the imperial archives. The brain was found abnormally small, its surface scarred with lesions from decades of epileptic trauma. The ventricles, the fluid-filled chambers, were enlarged, confirming long-standing hydrocephalus. The cerebellum, responsible for coordination, showed signs of atrophy. One physician noted that the tissue crumbled under the scalpel, as if long cooked. The heart was shrunken and fibrotic, its valves hardened. The lungs were streaked with black patches of necrotic tissue from repeated infections. The liver was discolored, possibly from mercury poisoning. The kidneys, small and scarred, had stopped functioning long before death. But the most unsettling detail was the reproductive system. The testicles were severely atrophied, no larger than walnuts, with near-total loss of functional tissue. One was entirely calcified. In the sterile language of anatomy, it was confirmation of what everyone had long suspected. Ferdinand had never been capable of producing an heir. His skeleton, too, bore traces of the ancestral curse. The cranial sutures were abnormally thick, evidence of premature closure in infancy. The jaw, though less exaggerated than that of his Spanish predecessors, jutted forward just enough to distort the mouth's alignment. The spine was slightly curved, the bones porous, early signs of rickets caused by metabolic imbalance. The imperial physicians, though trained to maintain decorum, could not disguise their horror. The emperor's body was a map of degenerative inheritance, every organ a scar of his lineage. Ferdinand was buried with pomp in the imperial crypt, among ancestors whose genes had written his doom. The ceremony glittered with candles and incense, but beneath the solemn chants lay a bitter irony. The dynasty that once claimed divine perfection had finally destroyed itself through devotion to purity. Modern scientists who later examined the surviving medical notes found something chillingly familiar. Ferdinand's symptoms, seizures, cognitive delay, sterility, skeletal deformity, align perfectly with genetic disorders caused by recessive mutations intensified through generations of intermarriage. Just as Charles II of Spain had embodied the collapse of the Spanish branch, Ferdinand represented the last echo of the Austrian line's own internal decay. 2 centuries apart, the same chromosomes carried the same curse. The genetic legacy of the Habsburgs remains one of history's darkest lessons. Across Europe, the dynasty's portraits line museum walls. Proud chins, pale skin, high foreheads, and that telltale, elongated jaw. Behind the myth of divine monarchy was a laboratory of suffering. Generations of men and women sacrificed to the idea that royal blood was too sacred to dilute. Ferdinand I of Austria was not a villain, nor a hero. He was a patient born into a throne, a man whose every heartbeat was an experiment in survival. In the end, the empire outlived him, but only by replacing blood with bureaucracy. His nephew Franz Joseph would reign for decades, but the purity Ferdinand's ancestors had prized was already extinct. The body of the emperor who never ruled had absorbed centuries of arrogance and translated them into suffering. So the next time you see a royal portrait with its calm gaze and sacred aura, remember Ferdinand. Remember the trembling hands, the locked jaw, the body that slowly turned against itself. Remember that beneath the gilded crowns and sanctified names, there is always flesh, and flesh, when trapped within the same bloodline for too long, will always find a way to collapse.